In his soon-to-be-published controversial new book, Stratfor's founder, George Friedman, argues that the President of the United States has the daunting task of preserving the Republic while managing America's global empire. The notion of empire is the core theme running throughout the book. Dr. Friedman joins me now in the first of a series of conversations about his new book. George, let's start with context. We're at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, a decade of Bush and Obama.
Well, I would argue that both Presidents Bush and Obama have abandoned some fundamental principles of American foreign policy and fundamental principles of good statecraft. The most important of which is letting other people fight for you, which is called academically the balance of power. The balance of power means that you don't insert yourself into every conflict that exists, but you allow others, in pursuing their own ends and their own interests, to carry the burden for you. This is the way we fought the Cold War. This is the way the United States involved itself in World War II. It was shifting the burden to others. And what President Bush and President Obama have both done is assume the primary burden of conducting foreign policy, very much outside the structure of coalitions. And this includes President Obama, who said he wouldn't do that, and as in Afghanistan, pursued that policy almost on his own with very little help from others. And this creates a situation where the United States is off balance. It is overcommitted constantly to one area and therefore vulnerable in other areas.
But of course it was 9/11 that changed things, that knocked America off its goals.
9/11 was a critical psychological event. It gave the American public, very reasonably, a sense of tremendous vulnerability. This is because the American public was extremely vulnerable. It frightened them. And in the aftermath of 9/11, anyone who wasn't terribly frightened was not in touch with reality. The danger was real and substantial. It was inevitable that the United States would focus, therefore, on the terrorist threat. The problem with focusing solely on the terrorist threat as the prime interest rather than one of many is that you create an imbalance in the situation where other threats are ignored. And the terrorist threat is ultimately not soluble. There will be terrorists if they choose to be. And there's no way that you can impose Homeland Security to wholly exclude the possibility of terror. You live with it. And the problem then becomes there is no terminal point. There is no point at which the war on terror is over. And if you commit everything to the war on terror, and there is no end to it, rather than being a global power, you become a regional power pursuing an end that can't be achieved. And that, in the end, is what the United States did. It's not an argument for saying that terror is not something that must be seriously combated. It is saying that it cannot be the only element of foreign policy.
Now, this America that's lost direction is, as you say, an empire in everything but name, just like the Holy Roman Empire, which in the end was neither holy nor Roman, or indeed the British Empire. The difference being, of course, the United States doesn't have imperial possessions.
When the British Empire began, when England began to rule the waves, it had tremendous influence over countries. It didn't have formal possessions for quite a while, and then it had some possessions and lost them, the American colonies, and so on. Power of an empire does not rest in the formal documents subordinating states. It rests in the power of the imperial entity relative to others. And when you take a look at the United States, you can see that enormous power. The power rests in the fact that the United States basically has 25% of the world's economy, nearly, being produced in the United States. It has by far the largest military force in the world. It controls all the oceans. Consider, in an age where international commerce is becoming more and more important and globalization becomes important, the oceans are the highways of the world. And whoever controls those oceans has the ability to stop or shape that trade. The United States hasn't done it. but it can. When you take all of these things, you can see the tremendous influence the United States has on other countries, potentially and in actuality, and sometimes unintentionally. Very frequently, the United States affects other countries without meaning to.
So what's the role of the president?
So the president is two people. One, the democratic leader of a republic. The other, a manager of a global system where the imbalance of power is so profound that he might be called an emperor if it were appropriate. The problem that he has is reconciling these two roles. And the first job that a president has in the 21st century is simultaneously managing the world and managing the republic without losing each. And for that, he has to be very clever, sometimes unscrupulous, sometimes dishonest, yet morally committed to the preservation of the republic and its interests.
The US has a navy and an air force that befits an empire, but its army is fully stretched. Doesn't it need a bigger army to carry this off?
I think rather than a bigger army, it needs a more sophisticated policy. The model is both Rome and Britain, neither of which had vast armies. They didn't use their armies as their primary tool to manage their empire. They used it as the final tool. The British didn't occupy India. It formed a system of alliances with elements in India, built an Indian army, and managed that Indian army with a small handful of troops. Similarly, the Romans, at their height, had an extremely small army. They didn't intend to directly govern. They governed through kings locally and so on. The problem the United States has, because it's so young and so new to the imperial game, if you will, is that it tries to manage its global interests with its own forces. And the globe is vast, and the United States Army is always going to be limited. The American strategy must be to control the world's oceans, have an army in reserve for when the balance of power fails, but spend your time manipulating the other countries in the world to get what you want.
George Friedman talking about his new book, The Next Decade, and later this month, available from good bookshops and from www.stratfor.com.